Hello, I am Lee Blackburn, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Athenian democracy today, something you'll be reading about, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it. And I think this is a topic that for most of us is well worth thinking about. After all, we believe that we live in a democracy. Most Americans believe very strongly that democracy is the best form of government. Various points in American history, Americans have been asked to die or even kill for the sake of democracy. So, given that, I think it's worth asking questions about where democracy actually comes from. Is it a matter of common sense? It's just obvious that democracy is the superior form of government. I don't think so, because the vast majority of governments in the history of the world have not actually been democratic or even tried to be democratic. So probably not just a matter of common sense. It's also the case that democracy is not something that really comes from the Bible. At least democracy is a form of government. You already know, I think, where democracy really originates from. And it originates with a group of Greeks who lived about 500 years before the time of Jesus. And of course, we get the word democracy from ancient Greek. It's a Greek word meaning something like people power or the rule of the people. So Greek democracy is really the inspiration for all democracies to come, even though, as we'll have occasion to note, our own democracy differs from Greek democracy in some pretty significant ways. I also want to note that despite the title of the lecture and the focus of the lecture, Athens was not the only Greek polis to implement democracy, but it was certainly the most influential one and probably the most radically democratic. Now, another point to make before kind of launching in, I don't want to give the impression that the ancient Greeks or even all ancient Athenians thought that democracy was a good thing. In fact, most of the ancient Greek writings that we have today, where authors, whether they're historians or philosophers, talk about democracy, it's often quite negative in tone. And the most famous example of this is Plato, the Athenian Plato. Of course, we can understand with Plato why he was wary of democracy, given that a democratic Athens had put his beloved mentor Socrates to death. But we'll also be reading from some of Plato's writings later in this unit, and I think that will even better explain why he was so skeptical of democracy. So democracy always had its critics, both now, but also then. Okay, so when we talk about the period of Athenian democracy, what time period are we talking about? We are really talking about a period from around 508 BC, during the time of Cleisthenes and his reforms, to something like 317 BC. This is when the Macedonians occupied Athens. Now, Athenian democracy is not a static thing that stays the same for 200 years. But in this lecture, I'll just be kind of focusing on what Athenian democracy looked like when it was sort of firing on all cylinders during the 4th century. During the 5th century, rather. Okay, now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of Athenian democracy, we have to ask the question, the historical question, why do we first see real democracy, however flawed it may be in some ways, but why do we first see real democracy at this place and at this time? So what are some of the preconditions in place that will make it possible for democracy to flourish in 5th and 4th century Athens? So we're going to talk about those historical developments. The first one is really a kind of cultural and intellectual development. And I'm going to use a fancy word here. That word is anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism. The tendency to celebrate the greatness of human beings in general and human reason in particular. So literally putting human beings at the center. Anthropos means human being, centrism at the center. So human beings are at the center of things. We start to see around, let's say 500 or so BC, in various aspects of Greek life, and especially of Athenian life, we see manifestations of this anthropomorphism. You've already read about it some in West in the World. And as we look at classical Greek art, we're going to see lots of other examples of that. So be looking for that quite soon. Let me just give you a couple of examples, and one or two of these has already been mentioned in a West in the World reading. So there's, in the realm of philosophy, we see this anthropocentrism. And one good example would be Xenophanes. Xenophanes, who mocked myth as a way of explaining the world. As we know, myth involves telling stories about the divine realm and the divine beings in order to explain why things are the way they are. And philosophers like Xenophanes thought, no, we can use our reason to give explanations for why things are the way they are, and we don't have to have recourse to the gods. So we see this tendency in philosophy. We even see it in history. Okay, you're reading about Herodotus this week, and Herodotus, some people would say, is really the first true historian, because he doesn't constantly appeal to divine beings to explain why a plague occurred or why somebody lost in a war. Okay? No, we can rationally study human history and give natural reasons for why things happen. Finally, you've read about this already last unit in West in the World, in the realm of science, in the realm of medicine in particular. You have people like Hippocrates, who made the sort of radical claim that all diseases have natural causes. Again, human beings can understand the natural causes of disease. We don't have to appeal to religion to make sense of things like that. So again, the common denominator here is that human beings, by virtue of the greatness of their reason, can make sense of themselves and the cosmos in which they live without having to resort to religious myth. Okay? And all of these figures that I've listed, and I could list many more, are living right around the time of Cleisthenes, as the 6th century is turning into the 5th. So it's no sheer coincidence, I don't think, that we see these intellectual tendencies at the same time as we see the emergence of democracy. Democracy, which is predicated on the idea that human beings are capable of governing themselves and of managing their own affairs. Take a moment and think about how different that idea is from Egyptian monarchy, for instance, right? If the pharaoh is a kind of manifestation of the god, that means the people of Egypt are directly ruled by a god. So imagine how radical Greek democracy looks compared to that way of thinking about things. Even ordinary people, according to the ancient Greeks, were capable of self-government. Again, why? Because of the greatness of human nature, the greatness of human reason. So one ancient historian has described democracy as a form of rational self-empowerment. I think that captures it very nicely, rational self-empowerment. Okay, the other development or precondition for the flourishing of Athenian democracy is more sort of political in nature. And it has to do with the aftermath of the Persian War. So the Persian War ends in 479. And I mean, you want to talk about a classic underdog story. The ancient Greeks, they have taken on the most powerful, the largest empire that the world, at least the Western world, has ever known. And they sent that empire home with its tail between its legs. So you can imagine the kind of confidence boost this would give the Greeks, and especially the Athenians, who were really the leaders, along with the Spartans, of the Greek resistance. So the Persian Wars enhance Athenian and Greek self-confidence, but they also offer something more tangible to the Athenians, which is money. Because after the Persians go back home, again, remember there's sort of two phases in the Persian War, there was, of course, still widespread anxiety that the Persians might come back a third time. And so the Athenians founded a league, a kind of defense league, meant to sort of be prepared for that possible invasion. This comes to be known as the Delian League, because at least initially the treasury for this league was on the island of Delos. That's going to change, and the treasury is going to be moved to Athens. So how does this work? Well, if you want Athens to help protect your little polis when the Persians come back, then you simply pay the Athenians tribute. You give them money in exchange for military protection. And as it turns out, the Persians don't actually come back. So the Athenians are raking in all this money, and they don't have to spend it all on defense. And so there's this kind of infusion of wealth into the city of Athens, and wealth makes possible more leisure, and more leisure makes possible higher degrees of participation in governments. And democracy, at least in its Athenian form, required high levels of participation, as we will see. So that's another factor in the success of Athenian democracy. Okay, now we can actually get to the nitty-gritty. We can talk about the main organs of government that made up Athenian democracy. But first, a couple of general observations about the workings of Athenian democracy. In theory, all adult males could take part. Okay? So no matter your income, no matter your social level, if you are a free adult male, then you can participate in government. Now, that's way more inclusive than just about any type of government that had ever existed before, but we should also take a moment to note who is excluded. Okay? So all women are excluded from Athenian democracy. Slaves are excluded. Even a group of people we would call metics, M-E-T-I-C-S. Those are sort of like resident aliens. We might call them legal immigrants, so non-citizens, but who were lawfully living in the polis of Athens. They could not participate. So this is just something worth bearing in mind, because we don't want to give the impression that Athenian democracy was a kind of perfect democracy by our standards. Secondly, it's worth noting, it's very hard for us to wrap our minds around, but in ancient Athens, there was no such thing as political parties. There wasn't even really a word for that. I mean, yes, certain politicians would become popular and there would be little cliques that would form around them. But there was not a party system, and there were very, very few people that could possibly be described as professional politicians. So this is a system of government run by amateurs. And I don't mean amateurs in a negative sense, just in the sense of non-professionals. This is really, in some ways, what the founding fathers of the United States wanted for this country. But of course, we know that it didn't really pan out that way. Okay, so now I think we can go ahead and begin talking about specific organs of government, starting with the most important and the most inclusive, and that is the assembly or the ecclesia. It's fine if you just want to remember the English word, but I thought I'd make you feel a little bit smarter by giving you the Greek terms as well. This is the most radically democratic of all organs of government because it was open to all adult male citizens. Anytime the assembly met, if you were an adult male citizen, you could attend and possibly vote, depending on the business that day. It met quite a bit. It met roughly 40 times a year. Of course, we have to keep in mind that most citizens would not be able to attend on a really regular basis, but still, theoretically, it was open. There would be votes on all sorts of matters pertaining to both foreign and domestic policy. And usually, the vote would just be a show of hands, and they would vote repeatedly until there was a clear majority. They wouldn't necessarily tally up all the votes. So that's sort of how that worked. So this is a really good example of what we might call direct democracy, which is something, of course, we have very little of in this country. We are a representative democracy. We vote on representatives who then go off to Nashville or Washington, D.C. to vote for us, allegedly in our interest. But here in the assembly, it didn't work that way. Every citizen had a vote, and every hand that was raised was equal. All right, another important body, governmental body, that was tightly connected to the assembly is the Boule, the Council of 500. Why 500? Well, one of Cleisthenes' reforms was to divide up all of the citizens of Athens into 10 tribes. Now, tribe doesn't really mean people who are related to one another, but 10 groups. And then 50 people would be chosen by lot. This is going to be a theme, by lot, randomly. 50 chosen from each of the 10 tribes. So 10 times 50, that's how we get the 500. No one could serve on the Boule more than twice, and you could not serve consecutive terms. So an example of a kind of built-in check on power. What did the Boule do? It was a kind of steering committee for the assembly. It prepared its agenda, and that's very important because when the assembly met, it had to stick to the script that the Boule had given it. There couldn't be, impromptu votes on something that occurs to somebody. No, the agenda prepared by the Boule had to be followed. And it had other duties as well. It supervised the financial administration of Athens as well, just to give an example. So these are governmental bodies, but there were also individual offices as well that are worth talking about. So magistrates, probably the most important group. No, I'm sorry, this is not the most important group, but just an example of one group of magistrates are a group of people known as archons. It literally just means rulers. There were about 9 chosen every year by lot. They could not serve successive terms. And they would do things like supervise the festivals of Athens. They would preside in court. And we'll talk about the courts here in just a moment. Most of the magistrates, like the archons, were in fact selected by lot. There were about 1,200 offices, and so about 1,100 of them were selected by lot. But I want to mention the most important group of office holders. These are the strategoi, the generals. They were not chosen by lot. They were actually elected. There would be 10 of them at any given time. And as the name suggests, they were not simply what we would consider political figures. They were not just politicians. They were, in fact, generals. They were the leaders of the Athenian army and navy. And here's a place where we might say that Athenian democracy is not sort of ideally democratic, because really, even to get your name on the ballot to serve as a strategos, you really would need to come from a wealthy family with lots of good connections in high places. So there was no, one of the reasons why this office was so powerful is there was actually no limit on re-election for the strategoi. So you could be re-elected time and again. And so this helps us to understand why a figure like Pericles could become such a dominant figure in Athenian politics, because he was repeatedly elected to be one of the strategos. So, you know, we don't have a figure like a president or a prime minister in ancient Athens, but these 10 strategoi are basically as close as we get to sort of chief executive officers. All right, well, let's move on to what we might call the judicial branch of Athenian democracy, the courts, the popular courts, the dikastaria. These were the courts of first resort. Every year, a panel of about 6,000 jurors was chosen, can you guess, by lot, to serve as jurors. And anybody was eligible. Again, doesn't matter your wealth, your status in society. All adult male citizens were eligible to be chosen. Now, Pericles, whom I just mentioned, makes an important innovation here. He is the one who first implements the policy that jurors ought to be paid for their services. So, you know, if you ever serve on a jury and you get a little check in the mail afterwards, you can thank Pericles for that. Now, why did he insist on this? Well, for him, it was an important democratic reform, right? Because if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of wealth, you may not be able to afford to take time off work and serve on a jury unless you are in some way being compensated for that jury service. So that's why he pushed for jury pay. Well, as the name suggests, the main function of the jurors was to serve as judges in the court. And the popular courts met frequently, about 200 times a year. So every other day, a little more frequently than every other day. The size varied, but typically in a given case, there were 401 or 501 jurors. Now, for a couple of reasons, those seem like very strange numbers to us. Let me explain those numbers for a moment. Why odd? Well, the odd numbers, 401, 501, that's easily explained. Unlike in our judicial system, you don't need a unanimous jury. You only needed a majority. And if you have an odd number, you can never have a tie. Now, the other thing that's strange about those numbers is, of course, the size of them, right? I mean, we're used to a jury of 12, so 401, 501, that sounds enormous. The Athenians took it for granted that there was going to be some corruption. Some jurors might be bought off, some jurors might be intimidated, but if you've got that many, the hope is that those corrupted or intimidating jurors will not actually swing the vote. All right, so let me just make a few concluding observations here. Again, Given the number of people who were excluded from Athenian democracy, I mean, if only adult male citizens could participate, that's only actually about 15% of the population of the polis of Athens. And that leaves an 85% that is disenfranchised. That certainly does not look or sound very much like democracy. But I think it is worthy of the name because of the radical idea. And again, not just a radical idea, but a radical idea that was put into practice, that every free adult male citizen, totally irrespective of wealth, reputation, status, family connections, can fully participate in the government, right? Even the poorest citizens had a voice. And not only could they go and vote at the assembly, but they could be chosen by lot to serve as an archon, or they could serve as a juror. They could really participate in a very robust kind of way. I think we also ought to call it a democracy, however imperfect it may have been, precisely because of all of the checks and balances that were built into it. I mean, we take great pride in the United States in our checks and balances. So we've seen several examples of checks and balances in the structure of Athenian democracy. So the council checks the power of the assembly by preparing its agenda. There are term limits for almost all magistrates, and so on. The final question to ask is what made this kind of government actually work? I mean, we talked about some of the historical conditions that helped to make it possible. What actually helped to make it work in practice? I think it only worked because there were a large number of citizens that were willing to invest a great deal of time into self-government, a great deal of time serving in these various capacities. I mean, we would have to kind of imagine something like the faculty and students of Milligan University coming together and saying, you know, we have all these administrators and we have all these staff people. Surely we could do that work ourselves. We don't need all those people. We can divvy up those responsibilities among ourselves. Well, that may or may not be possible, but I think we can all agree that if we tried to do that, that would be an enormous kind of commitment. You know, I think the ancient Athenians would have been fairly mystified by a common American sentiment, which is that you're a really good citizen if once every 4 years you go out and vote, you know, for one particular magistrate. For the Athenians, democracy, if it's really going to be democracy, if it's really going to be worth its salt, democracy has to be a matter of your everyday life. All right, thanks for your time.